This rare photograph, seemingly taken at some time during the late 1890s, shows a man named Gilbert Twigg, who, born in Cumberland, Maryland in 1867, was a corn miller by trade and a US Army veteran. With both of his parents dead, Twigg had been raised along with older brothers Isaiah and John and a younger sister Linny by his grandparents, but as a restless and roving young man, he had soon left Maryland to live in New Mexico, before then briefly moving northeast to Burton, Kansas. By 1891, he had relocated once again, some 15 miles south to the tiny town of Winfield, between Timber Creek and the Walnut River, in the heart of the Flint Hills, around 17 miles north of the Oklahoma border. On enlisting in the Army in 1896, Twigg had served in both the Spanish-American War of 1898 and in the US-Philippines War that broke out the following year, before being discharged on the 29th of April 1902 at the rank of sergeant with an excellent record of service. He lived briefly in Montana after that, but within 10 months had gone back to Winfield and found lodgings in the Thompson block on the corner of Millington Street by the junction of 9th and Main in the middle of town. By that point, however, his behaviour had become strange, it would be reported, paranoid, and he had become convinced that he was being shadowed by detectives and others that meant him harm. He was a little off in his mind, his Uncle Argle would remember, talked constantly about people being after him, and on seeing him loafing around town in local parks, rambling incoherently, some now knew him as Crazy Twigg. Local police officer George Nichols, meanwhile, had noticed him too. On the 1st of August 1903, Twigg arrived at a local gun store, selected a DeMoulin & Co. double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun, and asked for 2 boxes of powerful No. 5 buckshot rounds to go with it. His choice attracted the attention of the shop owner. "What are you going to do with that kind of shell?" he asked him. "I haven't yet decided," Twigg told him. He paid for his items and left. 12 days then passed in Winfield, and at 7 p.m. on Thursday the 13th of August, Twigg arrived at his Uncle Argle's house, wearing dark trousers, a striped shirt, and a Rough Rider's khaki coat and hat. He was carrying his shotgun with him, but Argle assumed that he was on his way to town and must have been hunting somewhere. He stayed but a minute or two and said nothing of how he planned to spend his evening. He bade him good night and left, before Argle retired early to bed. The sun then set at around 8:30 p.m. Darkness fell, and the only light was soon afforded by the gas lamps flickering on Main Street, where, at its junction with 9th Avenue, a crowd of some 3,000 people was starting to form. With a bandstand having been erected 1 block west of Twigg's lodgings, the Cayman Military Band, also known as Caton's Dozen, were about to begin a weekly concert, and, as a result, the streets were jammed with men, women and children. The band had been formed in 1889 by local businessman Harry Caton, who, for $30 a month, had hired W.H. Kamen, professor at the Winfield College of Music, to lead it, and, having travelled the country, they had performed for crowds as far afield as Louisiana, D.C., Chicago and Texas. With everyone in place, the concert then began. They were soon into their second number, which was reportedly a waltz, but as the crowd enjoyed the music, Twigg then arrived, from a darkened alleyway a block west of the junction. He was still carrying his shotgun, but he was now also armed with a Harrington & Richards double-action 6-shot .32 caliber revolver that he had bought with 100 rounds only 2 days previously. He was pulling a child's red wagon behind him, and inside it were his No. 5 buckshot rounds that he had purchased on the 1st and had aroused the attention of the shop owner. A group of teenage boys stood by the end of the alleyway, and Twigg turned towards one of them in particular. "I've got some tall shooting to do, son," he said. "You'd better run." He raised the shotgun to his shoulder and turned to face the bandstand. The waltz finished, and as drummer R.E. Oliver took a moment to look over some sheets on his music stand, the vast crowd applauded. Twigg took aim directly at him and fired. His first barrel missed, but the second hit him in his back and right arm, throwing him from his chair to the ground. Everyone jumped, and, standing nearby, a woman named Sally Milligan saw the flash from the shotgun, but it was too dark to see who fired it. A number of people ran to Oliver's aid, as Twigg grabbed 2 shells from the wagon to reload, but a section of the stunned crowd, apparently believing that he must have accidentally fired the weapon, then rushed similarly towards him. Twigg took a step back and dropped to one knee. "I'm going to shoot you all," he shouted, and fired both barrels directly at them. Men and women fell to the ground in pain, it would be reported, crushing children beneath them, and the crowd was sent scattering in every direction. Cigar salesman Elmer Farnsworth, a Winfield resident for over 20 years, was shot through the abdomen and critically wounded, as Twigg took another step back, reloaded, dropped back to his knee, and kept firing. Panic and confusion had quickly spread, and with some believing the shooting was coming from every quarter, hundreds howled and shrieked and ran, but no one seemed able to stop the frightful carnage. Outside of Craig's bookstore, 33-year-old Dawson Billiter was shot in the head, the round blowing out a section of his brain, which landed a few feet away from him on the pavement. 27-year-old carpenter Sterling Race was shot 6 times, and 15-year-old Ray Davis was fatally hit in his neck, abdomen, arm, and shoulder, with 8 bullets tearing through his bowel. Some newspapers would claim that he was the boy Twigg had told to run on arriving at the scene. Inside a horse and cart by the end of the alleyway, a man named Benedict Skalicki raced to get away and could see Twigg firing into the crowd as he did so. Hundreds were running for the doorways and stairwells of nearby buildings to take cover, but Twigg continued to reload and kept going. Numerous people were now killed or critically wounded, and with 5 lying dead in the darkness in the middle of the street, with almost a score of others about them. It was a scene almost impossible to describe. A man named J.B. Story was among them, with 31-year-old carpenter Charles Thomas, 19-year-old Port Smith, 23-year-old Otis Carter, and a man named William Bowman, who had travelled more than 10 miles to see the concert. A woman named Florence Gregg had been shot in the throat, and local man Arthur Hansford was hit in the face, blinding him in one eye. Crowds of people were screaming and trampling each other to get away, but the shots kept coming. Twigg, reloading after every 2 shots, was stepping backwards each time he did so, and moving back towards the alleyway from which he initially emerged. From a short distance south on Main Street, however, Winfield police officer George Nichols, who had previously noted Twigg's strange behaviour, was running north for the scene. On reaching the junction, someone told him where the killer was shooting from, but he was now in the line of fire himself, and so ran another half-block north and turned left into the alleyway by the side of number 811. He ran westwards through the dark behind a number of buildings, turned left again, and was now approaching from behind him. Nichols was carrying a .44 caliber revolver with him, and on arriving at the spot took position behind a tree, from where he then saw Twigg, leaning eastwards against a telegraph pole, around 40 steps away, with about half a dozen empty shells scattered about the floor beside him. Around the bandstand, the dead and injured were lying in almost a heap at the edge of the crowd, great streams of blood pouring from their wounds. A great pool of blood had formed, it would be reported, in a veritable lake, as the blood of the dead and wounded mixed together and flowed into the gutter. With around 30 seconds having now passed since his last shots, 8 people were dead or dying, while 24 others were wounded, and some would suffer lifelong disabilities. Nichols drew his gun. Now standing only feet away, he took aim at Twigg, but what happened next depends on where you read it. Some sources would recall hearing 2 shots from the alleyway, and some would claim that Nichols shot him in the stomach but didn't kill him. Some would claim that he shot him in the head, but others would suggest that Nichols' shot was actually erased from the official record for fear that the shooting of a white man by a black policeman would cause an uproar, even despite the circumstances. Regardless, wounded or not, Twigg drew his handgun, held it beneath his jaw, and pulled the trigger, the round blowing out through the top of his head. Taking cover nearby, a man named Link Smith heard it happen. It was a much lighter shot than the others, he would remember. Nichols rushed towards him and found him lying face down on his hands and knees in a pool of blood and with his shotgun still in his arms. He was groaning very heavily, and his revolver was now lying beneath him. Having ran the same route that Nichols did, and with a shotgun of his own, a man named Cal Ferguson then arrived, and, with Nichols and Sheriff J.S. Day, who had ran for the scene from 2 blocks east, lifted him from the ground and began carrying him towards the junction with Main Street. The screams and writhing of the injured, and the gasping of those whose life was ended by the bullets, it would be reported, presented a terrible appearance. But almost nobody realized the 3 were carrying the killer as they walked by them and laid him on the bandstand. Ferguson shouted for a doctor, but nobody responded. Twigg was bleeding profusely, breathing very heavily, and was mortally wounded. Amidst the dead and dying that lay along the junction of 9th and Main, with the 3 standing by him, he then died. The massacre that took place that evening in Winfield was America's first recorded active shooter situation, and, to this day, is the worst to ever take place in Kansas.